Welcome to the third Market Dojo Procurement Podcast. I'm Peter Smith and I'm joined by Alun Rafique and Nick Martin from procurement technology firm Market Dojo. Hi guys.
Hi Peter.
Hi Peter.
So our core topic today is performance measurement and management in the procurement context. But before we get into that, we've got some procurement news headlines. We've had a summer dominated by politics and Brexit, of course, since our last podcast, but we found a few interesting procurement-related news stories for you. And in the procurement world, we saw the acquisition of procurement leaders by World 50, an international networking organization, I must admit I'd never heard of, for corporates to meet, benchmark and talk about issues, no doubt in nice places with nice food and drink. Or is that just me being a bit cynical? But procurement leaders has been a big success story in our industry. So well done to the three founders, and we'll watch their next steps with interest. Mark Pereira already has developed software firm Visible, of course.
It seems all good businesses have three co-founders.
Of course. Did you work with procurement leaders at all, Alan?
Well, we've crossed paths, but our gold reserves weren't quite deep enough as yet.
Yes. I think most of the solution providers I know have worked with them. I have a lot of time and respect, but they did charge quite a lot of money, has to be said. Anyway, back to you, Alan.
Well, anyway, I mean, Deliveroo announced that as well as delivering food to customers, they will be offering food procurement service to restaurants, takeaways, pubs, and so on. It's a really interesting move with Deliveroo looking to work both ends of the supply chain. We're not sure we could see Raymond Blanc or Angela Hartnett rushing to the service. For top chefs, the provenance of what they buy is key, and they develop relationships with their key suppliers. But for thousands of small and mid-range outlets, there may well be an opportunity here.
Yeah, I think it's also another sign of what we've seen in recent years, which is the professionalization of procurement. So moving from amateurs, both in businesses, but also here like chefs and pub managers doing the buying, to a situation where real procurement category experts are doing it, as in this case from within Deliveroo. So very, very interesting. Onto the economy, and UK figures announced over the summer weren't good, with GDP down 0.2% in the second quarter. That may in part have been because firms had built up stocks with the expectation of a March Brexit. Then they ran down those stocks once the big day was delayed. But it increases fears of what a hard Brexit in particular might do to the UK economy, and indeed to the rest of Europe, which doesn't look too strong itself at the moment.
Extreme weather over the summer reminded us that the supply chain risk needs to consider all sorts of different aspects, from weather events to cyber risk. The UK saw its hottest day ever, 38.7 degrees in Cambridge, followed by August storms that led to the cancellation of events such as the Boardmasters Music Festival and indeed our own team do at the Bristol Balloon Fiesta. So the message is, make sure you have your risk plans in place, look at where insurance is appropriate, and how else you might mitigate the significant risks. This is vital work for procurement these days.
Yeah, I might have lost my parking fee for the Balloon Fiesta, but we did end up doing crazy golf, so I think we did have a good time anyway.
Excellent. And talking of risk, perhaps more seriously, Hong Kong is suddenly on the agenda too. Long seen as a stable hub for supply and trading, the social unrest there must be making many firms reconsider supply chain strategies. But on a happier note, we're moving into the autumn conference season for procurement, and there's many events run by individual firms and then some major industry events too. SIPS holds its annual event on the 31st of October, Brexit Day. Unusually for SIPS, it's a two-day event running on into the 1st of November. Then we have ProcureCon EU in October in Barcelona. And before that, eWorld Procurement and Supply in the somewhat less glamorous surroundings of the Connaught Rooms in London on September the 24th. There are also a whole host of events run by individual procurement solution firms, of course, including, I believe, the Market Dojo customer event on the 17th of October.
Yeah, you don't want to miss that, Peter. It should be a fantastic event at Stonehouse Court in near Stroud. It's a bit of a plug there. and it should be a really good event. It's for everyone's invited, so come and meet everyone there. And while we're talking about plugs there, finally we enjoyed reading a new book titled, a Procurement Compendium by an author we haven't come across yet, Peter Smith. Yes, this is a collection of Peter's articles, mainly from Spend Matters days, and they cover everything from the Olympics to the Crystal Methodist, if you remember him, a very interesting man himself, and from MOD failures to dodgy fish. It's an interesting read, it really is, as well as including lots of good procurement ideas and best practice, including the story from one of our dear co-founders. You'll have to guess which one when you read it, and it's only £12.99 on all good websites, and I've bought my book already on Amazon.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind. If you can do a review as well, that would be even better. Well, as long as it's a good review, of course.
Okay, certainly.
So thanks for that plug. So now moving on to our main topic for this podcast, I'm going to say a few words about measuring and communicating the performance of procurement, and then we'll open it up for some discussion. So going back a few years, in my last role as a procurement director at NatWest Group, I had an early meeting with my new boss, the main board CFO. I talked about how we would measure procurement performance. Oh yes, he said, I've been looking back at the savings your predecessors declared. Now bear in mind that the three predecessors in my role were all eminent SIPS presidents. But the CFO frowned and said, if I add up all the savings over the last few years, I've worked out that we should by now be paying nothing for the goods and services we buy. And that's one of the problems with how procurement often measures and declares savings. Frankly, organizations and functions that declare 10% plus savings year after year are simply talking nonsense. Or rather, what they are doing is not measuring savings properly. I also wrote a semi-humorous note years ago when I was doing consulting in the centre of government with what was then OGC. My note was called 10 Ways to Fiddle Your Procurement Savings. And I discovered that it eventually got to very senior levels in government. I was never sure that was so that Her Majesty's Treasury could stop departments fiddling the numbers, or because everyone wanted to know how to do it and was using my list as a crib sheet. So a couple of examples. There's the old get an unfeasibly high quote for a one-off purchase, a piece of equipment or a consulting project, then negotiate a huge saving. I mean, often the supplier is in on that. It's a conspiracy, really. And that is declared a saving, even if the final price is twice the budget for the expenditure, of course. You can also claim demand management savings, even if prices rise and overall spend increases, amazingly. So, for instance, if you buy 800 laptops at £1,100 a time this year, and last year you bought 1,000 for only 800, you claim a demand management saving. So that's 200 fewer laptops you bought at 1,100 a time, so a saving of 220k, even though the price has actually risen substantially, and indeed overall spend has gone up by 80k. Or you could just stop all travel or all IT spend, and that's a saving, even if the business grinds to a halt. So going back to NatWest, I changed the methodology for recording and claiming savings, having got my boss to agree first that he wouldn't fire me when he saw the numbers were 50% down on previous years. In my opinion, savings have to relate to real money and have a real benchmark or comparator to measure against. So saving might mean process improvements, take out headcount, or a true like-for-like comparison on the same goods or services year on year. So I paid £800 for this laptop last year. For the equivalent purchase this year, we've negotiated 700. That's a saving. And of course, you should offset increases. So if I can claim a saving from what is purely a market movement, I've seen people do that in energy or petrol prices, then I should include those increases too. But very few people do that. However, procurement performance reporting can and should go much further than savings, in my opinion. And a balanced business scorecard approach, perhaps with 4 quadrants, is what I've always recommended. So there's nothing wrong with recording genuine savings within that, but there are other financial metrics that can be included in that section of the scorecard. The cost of the function itself, of course, is one. Working capital issues such as stock holding or invoice payment is another area. Secondly, there are the service metrics. Now, once upon a time, we would have looked at how quickly do requisitions or purchase orders get processed. Now, that might be outdated now with user catalogs and so on, but there's still a good point there. But what about how internal stakeholders rate procurement? A net promoter score, perhaps? Then we have the people quadrant. There are probably some easier things to measure here, actually. Retention rates, filling roles internally, levels of qualification and training amongst staff, perhaps staff satisfaction questionnaires and so on. And finally, and perhaps actually the most important, what we might call the strategic quadrant. Here we're looking to capture some quite tricky but really important things about the way that procurement contributes. I like to see measures around spend coverage, for instance. What percentage of third-party spend does procurement genuinely influence? Getting input from suppliers can be very useful too, and increasingly innovation is a key driver. I know one major consumer goods firm where the whole company, the corporate target is that 50% of revenues should come from products that have been launched in the last 3 years. And 70% of that 50% should come from supplier generated ideas. Now that's a really great metric for procurement because it takes a lot of skillful work to achieve that. Think about it, it dictates how procurement has to work with suppliers, has to have strong processes, shared benefits, and goes right back to just simply knowing who your key strategic suppliers really are. Then there's the question of communicating the benefits. That's perhaps mainly for another day. Let's just say good procurement teams use their metrics not in an arrogant or boastful way, but as a tool with internal stakeholders to look at how they can improve collaborative working further and generate more benefits. Now to finish and take us on into our discussion, I should say that auctions do often actually give us one of those genuine opportunities to claim savings. If it's something we've bought before, or there's a clear market price, we can see the benefits of a successful auction, or indeed other sourcing events. So opening it up to discussion, Nick, have you seen some, let's start with the bad practice in terms of this whole savings thing?
Yeah, I mean, apart from the things you've already mentioned, there's a couple of other things we've seen quite frequently where procurement are acting. Firstly, where procurement are acting depending on how they're measured. So, most common example we've seen is that savings are only recognised in the current financial year, and this means that towards the end of the year, negotiation on the contracts is held off, so they can recognise that in the next financial year instead. And a second way we've seen a second bad practice is where we've seen companies measured on the number of auctions instead of looking at the value or the savings from the auctions. And we've seen that manifest itself in ways such as people actually running auctions for the mowing of the lawn at the company HQ just to bump up the number of auctions that they'd run.
It's crazy, really. I mean, that financial year thing is just really daft. So you're foregoing savings because of the way they're measured. And I suppose it's a little bit like when I did a lot of work in the public sector, the end of the financial year thing where you couldn't carry money forward. So if you didn't spend all your budget, it would get cut the following year. So come the last couple of months of the year, there's a sort of desperate rush to spend all the money, which is crazy, really.
Well, maybe if some of that was spent on us, we might not mind so much.
Well, it's true, actually. When I was mainly doing consulting work, I had a number of usually had a number of inquiries in February and March that were clearly, can we spend a few grand to use up a budget with you? But anyway, let's move on to the more positive side. Examples of organisations doing a good job of measuring benefits. Alan, do you want to comment?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I'd agree with all your points mentioned above. I mean, people need to take a very honest view of tracking savings and not just looking at the savings, but the point you mentioned about offsetting it against increases. I mean, there are challenges where people haven't bought a product or service before where that can be difficult to measure. Some of the good things we've seen there are around should cost exercises, or taking an average of the quotes as a baseline instead of maybe the highest quote. I think it's important that an organisation looks at budgets and estimates the savings at the beginning of the year against robust methodologies, and uses that same approach as the year moves forward. For example, tracking the savings against budgets based on estimated volumes and previous costs does help to take account of volume increases in a fair way. Obviously, it takes a bit more time at the beginning of the year, but we have seen a lot of good procurement practices around that coming in. I think the other side of the argument is how the procurement function is compensated. I mean, having a bonus scheme strictly related to pure savings can lead to a lot of bad practices, and so the bonus structure needs to be fairly balanced against the savings and the life cycle and the team as a whole.
Yeah, I've seen cases where people were bonused individually on savings, and of course it doesn't help with collaborative working within the team. You know, people don't want to share their work, even if there would be benefits, and you get people fighting over which project or contract they're working on based on which you're going to generate the biggest savings. So it's got to be handled carefully, I think. But now looking at auctions, which is really where Market Dojo started, of course. I'm sure you quote benefits. Do you have data on what people do achieve in terms of savings there?
Yeah, we're in the fortunate position, obviously, to have seen many auction events run through the Market Dojo platform, and we've brought some of that information together and done some analysis on it. That data's information available on our website for anyone that's interested to look at that. A couple of pieces spring to mind. We did an auction analysis infographic, which looks at overall different auction types and number of participants and things of that nature, and gives some metrics on what kind of savings you can expect to receive. And we've also done something we call our periodic table of auctions, which was based on some work my colleague Nick Drew did a year or so ago, where we went through all the events that have been run through our platform. We categorized them, and then we've built a kind of, based on the periodic table of elements, different categories of spend and what kind of savings you can expect to receive if you run an auction for them. So, for example, what we've seen for HR services is on average a 23% saving, and then just picking one more example, road freight, a 15.7% saving. So you can actually start to look at the particular categories you're interested in and understand what's kind of average for those.
Yeah, interesting. And do you see other benefits from running auctions as well as the potential for savings?
I mean, yeah, absolutely. I mean, from the supplier side, I mean, the University of West of England did a study a while back about how auctions can actually strengthen the relationship with the suppliers through the transparency. You need to do a lot of upfront work to run an auction, so they're bidding on like for like if it's solely price focused, for example. And that transparency is really good for the suppliers and giving them feedback. And so it's a great opportunity for a lot of people invited to negotiate. I mean, sometimes you get the Achilles heel side of it, that transparency can kind of feedback in a bad way. I mean, I remember being next to a supplier at a PwC dinner event in Wales, and the supplier next to me had lost about 3 auctions in a row and said, well, we're not going to take part again, which I think is the wrong viewpoint personally, because you've got to take a lot of feedback from that and look to improve. I remember when I was working at Rolls-Royce, when you do RFQs, it's quite a standard to get a bunch of quotes and go with the winning quote and not get back to the other ones, and the supplier gets no feedback whatsoever. So I think from the supplier side, there are lots of benefits. And from the host side, the person running the auction, absolutely, it increases the number of options through the price compression during the auction itself. You get data centralization, and even though there's a bit more upfront work to run an auction in terms of making sure the specs and the SLAs are nailed down, the implementation, the overall process is far quicker, and you're set up for the following years. We often have customers who come back year and year again to run the same auction, with an update or specs or volumes, etc.
Yeah, and of course, I guess increasingly we've seen auctions that actually are run on a multi-criteria basis, so it's not purely on price, and you can look at other factors as well, which I think is good. The key thing again is transparency. People need to understand, how the process is working and how the selection is going to be made. So
yeah, absolutely. I've seen some. If one of the criteria is, do they live next door to me? That can that might slightly bias
yes.
the overall process.
Well, as long as it's transparent and you know that you're not going to win if you're 500 miles away. Illegal in the public sector, of course.
Of course.
Yeah, I mean, another interesting point. I remember my friend Guy Allen, who's a CPO in different organizations, telling me he'd used auctions a couple of times as a new CPO to get in front of top management, even invite them along to the live auction event to demonstrate what his procurement team could deliver. Is that something you've seen with other customers?
Yes, in fact, some of our most memorable experiences of Market Dojo have been in those kind of examples where the procurement team have, on the day of the auction, arranged to bring all the stakeholders and the senior management together. Perhaps probably the most memorable example of that was our very first auction at Hamworthy Combustion. So in that case, the team there put the auction together in a week. It was run by someone who'd never run an auction before, and it was all done to coincide with a board meeting. And on the day, we had 40 people in the room, and they saved 25% on a 20k tender. So it was a great result and a really interesting experience for everyone involved.
And that was your very first event in Market Dojo?
Yes, it was. It was a real milestone for us and quite stressful for everyone, I think, that day.
Exciting, yeah. So circling back to my monologue, do you guys think the balanced scorecard is the right way forward? So looking at those different factors as well as savings?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, savings is definitely an area which needs to be measured. Although procurement, unlike sales, has a lot more facets around the function. And I think by looking at the balanced scorecard from a measuring savings from a bonus approach for just how they kind of look at themselves, I think is a very sensible idea.
Yeah, I think we've still got a bit of work to do as a profession to get that message out to all the CFOs and COOs and CEOs that CPOs report to, but I think it's the way to go anyway. So, okay, so we've run out of time again. So thanks very much to Alun and Nic for their contribution today. And thanks to Market Dojo for developing this podcast. We hope you've enjoyed it, and I think we should be back with more shortly. I think there will be one more before Christmas. So it's goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me.